I would like to take this opportunity to thank the Centre for International Finance and Regulation for supporting this research. Our research team at Melbourne Law School, comprising Professor Ian Ramsey, Mr. Ben Saunders and me, recently completed a project on the regulatory and corporate governance aspects of securities lending. I would like to outline briefly the findings of this project. Securities lending is the temporary transfer of securities, mainly shares, from one party to another. At the conclusion of the so-called loan, the borrower is required to deliver equivalent securities to the lender. Securities lending is an important and growing part of global market activity. While it is said to perform valid and useful functions such as increasing market liquidity, many, particularly during the recent global financial crisis, have expressed concerns that it also leads to market instability. Concerns with security lending have focused primarily on its role in facilitating short selling. During the recent global financial crisis, markets and regulators were concerned about the potential destabilizing effect of short selling on financial markets, particularly in relation to the shares of financial institutions. There are several motivations for borrowing and lending securities. Lenders have one particular motivation: to generate income. Typically, lenders of securities are institutional investors such as insurance companies, pension and superannuation funds, and investment funds, which lend out securities that form part of their asset portfolios in order to generate income in the form of lending fees. For some lenders, securities lending contributes a significant proportion of their revenue from their investment portfolios. Borrowers, on the other hand, are usually securities dealers and hedge funds that wish to use the borrowed securities as part of a trading strategy. The most common reason for borrowing securities is to cover a short position, especially to enable the borrower to fulfill a settlement obligation and to enable the borrower to engage in a short sale of the borrowed securities. Securities are also borrowed and lent for other reasons, such as the desire to borrow cash collateralized against the lent securities. According to the most recent estimates available to the research team, the Australian securities lending market is worth roughly between 15 billion Australian dollars to 25 billion Australian dollars, according to the latest estimates available. As part of this project, we also examined the legal agreements for securities lending. The two prime examples worldwide are the Global Master Securities Lending Agreement, which is widely used internationally, and, insofar as the Australian market is concerned, the Australian Master Securities Lending Agreement. These agreements make it clear that, although the terminology of borrowing and lending is used in connection with these so-called securities loans, a loan of securities actually transfers all right, title, and interest in and to those securities, free and clear of any liens, claims, charges or encumbrances, or any other interest of the transferor of the securities. In addition, the borrower is required to redeliver securities of an identical type, nominal value, description, and amount to the particular securities borrowed, together with the benefit of any conversion, subdivision, or other specified corporate actions. Thus, the borrower is not required to redeliver the exact securities which were transferred to it originally, but instead is required only to redeliver equivalent securities. Regulation of securities lending in Australia comes from several sources. Our project focused on the provisions of the Corporations Act 2001 relating to naked and covered short selling and the disclosure of interest in listed companies and managed investment schemes. The Short Selling Amendment Act, which was enacted in December 2008 in the wake of the global financial crisis, clarified the regulatory position in Australia relating to short selling. This Amendment Act prohibited naked short selling and required the disclosure of covered short sales. In summary, a seller must, before entering into a covered short sale through a licensed intermediary, make disclosure of certain prescribed information to the licensee, which in turn is required to disclose that same information to the operator of the licensed market on which the short sales are taking place. This information includes particulars such as the total number of securities sold, and the name of the issuer of the securities. The market operator must, in addition, publicly disclose the total number of covered short sales on a daily basis. This transactional reporting is supplemented by further amendments to the corporations regulations that introduce positional reporting obligations by requiring short sellers to disclose to the market their short positions on a daily basis. In addition to the disclosure obligations introduced by these recent amendments, a securities loan can also trigger disclosure under the existing substantial disclosure obligations for both the lender and borrower in the same transaction. There is some confusion as to whether a lender, which has only the right to have delivered to it equivalent securities to those lent, can have a relevant interest in the securities originally lent. The regulator ASIC has, however, confirmed that it will interpret the relevant interest provisions of the Corporations Act as having been satisfied by the lender of securities. In the course of our project, we also examined the appropriate legal characterization of securities loans in the context of the new Personal Property Securities Act. The Beaconwood decision, which took place prior to the commencement of this Act, is vitally important to the interpretation of securities loans. In this decision, an Australian court held that the AMSLA, the Australian Master Securities Lending Agreement, is effective to transfer title to the securities lent, as opposed to creating a mortgage or other security interest over the securities to support the repayment of the cash collateral provided by the borrower of the securities, and this has been upheld in subsequent Australian decisions. On this basis, the risk that the AMSLA and the equivalent agreements will be treated by an Australian court as creating a Personal Property Securities Act security interest appears to be minimal, despite the fact that this Act looks to the substance of transactions as opposed to their legal form. Finally, our project examined the impact of securities loans on shareholders' voting rights and the governance of listed Australian companies. Again, despite the terminology of lending, a loan of securities involves an absolute transfer of title to the loaned securities to the borrower. The borrower obtains title to the securities together with all rights and entitlements attaching to the securities, and the borrower is thus able to vote those securities. This position leads to a divergence between the legal nature of securities lending and its economic substance. Although the lender does not have legal title to the loaned securities during the currency of the loan, the underlying economic reality is that the lender remains the owner of the securities. At the termination of the loan transaction, the borrower is required to redeliver an equivalent number of identical securities, irrespective of the value at the time of redelivery. Thus, the lender, and not the borrower, is exposed to any change in the value of the lent securities. Any increase in the value of the securities is gained, and any decrease suffered by the lender, not the borrower. The AMSLA requires the borrower to manufacture to the lender the economic benefits of ownership during the term of the loan. The borrower's stake or interest in the securities is therefore only temporary. Upon redelivery of the borrowed securities, the borrower's interest ceases. This leads to a situation where the party controlling the voting rights attaching to the securities, the borrower, has no underlying economic interest in those securities. A loan of securities thus separates voting rights from the economic ownership of those securities. This upsets the foundational understanding of corporate law that shareholders who vote possess an economic interest in the company, and this may be problematic from the view of corporate governance. The seminal work assessing the corporate governance implications of this situation is that of Professors Henry Hu and Bernard Black from the United States. They noted that developments in the financial markets allowed voting rights attaching to securities to be separated or decoupled from the corresponding securities. Investors were thus able to obtain an economic interest only in shares without the corresponding voting rights by entering into equity swap transactions. Professors Hu and Black referred to this as hidden ownership. They also noted the converse position relevant to our project, where it is possible to obtain voting rights without the corresponding economic interest. The primary way of achieving this is through securities lending. An investor who borrows shares obtains legal title to the shares, including any voting rights attached to the shares, and so is able to vote those shares at a shareholders' meeting. However, the borrower's interest in these shares is only temporary, and the borrower has no economic interest in the company based on the structure of the securities loan documentation. A variant of this strategy is record date capture. Company laws, including Australia's, typically specify a record date for determining eligibility to vote at a shareholders' meeting. Securities lending allows a person to borrow shares in order to be registered on the record date and thus be entitled to vote. The borrower can then dispose of those shares prior to the meeting, retaining the right to vote at that meeting, but without holding the relevant shares. Professors Hu and Black use the term empty voting to describe the situation where a person's voting rights exceeded their economic ownership of a company, so called because the votes have been emptied of their associated economic interest. They also noted that the classic theory of voting rights upon which corporate voting rules are predicated was based on the status of shareholders as claimants to the company's value, which gives shareholders appropriate incentives to make value-enhancing decisions relating to the company and to monitor management performance. Making voting rights proportional to a person's share in a company's residual value matches economic incentives with voting power. Vote buying via securities lending upsets this. As a result, vote buying strikes directly at both the economic and legal logic behind shareholder voting rights. Put simply, the person who exercises the voting rights is not the one who bears the consequences of that decision. Empty voting thus distorts the incentives of shareholders. Many commentators have accepted Hu and Black's analysis and argued that empty voting is problematic. Their work has also been quoted with apparent approval by regulators. Other commentators have noted that empty voting upsets the assumptions on which the allocation of corporate voting rights to shareholders rests, and thus compromises the ability of shareholder voting to perform its proper role. Shareholders who own no economic interest have no incentive to exercise the voting rights in the best interests of the company. Thus, when securities are lent, the voting rights may not be exercised in the best interests of the company or in the best interests of the lender of the securities. Empty voters may prefer that the company's share price fall rather than rise. The borrower may be perceived to be using its voting power primarily contrary to the interests of the company. This may be particularly problematic where borrowed shares have a decisive influence on voting incomes, which will likely be the case where resolutions are decided by narrow majorities. Thus, many commentators consider that empty voting is largely a harmful practice. However, this view is by no means unanimous. Professors Hu and Black themselves acknowledge that empty voting or decoupling is not always a bad thing. Other commentators have argued that empty voting could have positive effects in some situations. For example, one commentator has argued that empty voting by committed shareholders may be beneficial, namely that vote trading may increase efficiency in the market because uninformed shareholders can sell their votes via securities lending to more informed shareholders or investors to increase the value of the voting outcome. Vote selling may therefore be beneficial in facilitating an active market for corporate control and acting as a monitoring device. Vote selling and buying can be viewed as an efficiency-enhancing mechanism, a way for voting rights to flow to the person with the most reliable information, thus maximizing the most profitable use of those rights. In general, it has been very hard for us to obtain evidence of empty voting. What evidence there is tends to be largely anecdotal in nature. The small number of empirical surveys of securities lending that have been undertaken indicate that borrowing activity may be driven by objectives other than vote buying. Nonetheless, there is a consensus amongst industry bodies worldwide condemning the use of securities lending to acquire votes. For example, the International Corporate Governance Network's Securities Lending Code of Best Practice states that borrowers of shares who have only a temporary interest in the shares and who exercise voting rights attached to the shares can distort the result of general meetings, bring the governance process into disrepute, and undermine confidence in the market. Borrowing shares for the primary purpose of exerting influence, deliberately reducing or suppressing the vote at a shareholders meeting, or gaining control of a company without sharing the risks of ownership is seen as a violation of best practice. To date, empty voting has received little attention in Australia. This issue was briefly considered in the 2008 Parliamentary Joint Committee on Corporations and Financial Services report, Better Shareholders, Better Company. Several submissions received by this committee expressed opposition to the practice of vote renting via securities loans, namely where a person borrows shares to obtain the right to vote those shares in order to influence the outcome of a shareholder vote. The committee considered that vote renting in no way contributes to good corporate governance and should not be permitted. The committee recommended that the government should investigate the most appropriate regulatory framework for ensuring that stock lenders retain the voting rights attached to the lent securities. However, in light of the lack of evidence that there is a widespread problem of empty voting in Australia and elsewhere, there is insufficient evidence to warrant, in our view, regulatory intervention. The Australian disclosure regime is adequate and already requires disclosure of substantial holdings of borrowed shares. Empty voting positions, assuming that a significant portion of shares are borrowed for the purposes of voting, as opposed to other purposes such as covered short selling, are already captured by Australia's disclosure rules. To conclude, the regulatory changes introduced by the Short Selling Amendment Act provide for both transactional and positional information about securities loans. In addition, securities loans that have been documented using the AMSLA or an equivalent agreement are unlikely to be recharacterized as giving rise to security interests under the Personal Property Securities Act. Finally, there is little evidence in favor of empty voting taking place, and thus regulatory intervention, we believe, is not warranted, particularly given the scope of the existing disclosure obligations imposed on lenders and borrowers of shares. Thank you.